In the heart of New York City, 1890, a beacon of Gilded Age prosperity shone from the dining room of the Providence. Here, amidst the warm glow of gas lamps and the intricate gleam of polished mahogany, the city's wealthiest families gathered. The air was thick with the scent of French perfume and expensive cigars, a fragrant testament to the industrial fortunes that built the metropolis. At the center of it all stood Elias, the elder of the two brothers who owned the establishment. His voice, while smooth and resonant, carried across the clinking of silverware and crystal as he delivered a heartfelt speech on the Christian duty of charity, on the moral obligation to uplift the city's less fortunate. His words were a soothing balm to the consciences of his patrons, who applauded his philanthropy, blissfully unaware of the profound and nefarious irony that seasoned every word he spoke. For them, Elias was a saint, a pillar of the community whose generosity was as renowned as his restaurant's cuisine. The centerpiece of this nightly ritual, the dish that had secured the Providence its legendary status, was a stew of unparalleled richness. It arrived at each table in ornate porcelain tureens, its steam carrying a complex, intoxicating aroma that promised warmth and deep satisfaction. Chefs from rival establishments had tried for years to replicate its flavor, a sublime and savory blend that was both rustic and refined, comforting yet utterly unique. The meat, they noted, was impossibly tender, dissolving on the tongue with a subtle, almost sweet aftertaste that defied classification. Elias would simply smile when asked about the secret, attributing it to a long-held family recipe and the freshest possible ingredients. Diners savored every spoonful, praising the brothers' culinary genius. They consumed it with gusto, this symbol of their success, a meal that was the very taste of high society, never once questioning the true cost of its exquisite perfection. But beyond the gaslit opulence of the main dining room, another New York existed, just a few blocks away, in a labyrinth of dark, rain-slicked alleyways behind the restaurant. The Gilded Age was a cruel fiction. Here, the air was heavy with the stench of wet refuse and human desperation. The only light came from the occasional sliver of moon between tenement buildings, illuminating the hunched figures seeking shelter from the biting wind. It was a world of profound invisibility, a hidden sewer of humanity where forgotten Civil War veterans, displaced immigrant families, and the hopelessly sick huddled together for warmth. This was the city's shadow, a population so thoroughly ignored by the society celebrating inside the Providence that their comings and goings were of no consequence to anyone. Their anonymity was their greatest vulnerability, a silent invitation to predators who knew that no one would ever notice if one of them simply vanished into the night. It was into this forgotten world that the younger brother, Matthew, would emerge from a heavy iron door at the back of the restaurant. He was the antithesis of his charming brother Elias, a hulking, taciturn man whose presence was as solid and grim as the brick walls around him. He moved with a quiet, unnerving purpose, his eyes scanning the shadows not with pity, but with the pragmatic appraisal of a stockman selecting an animal. On this particular night, his gaze fell upon a man shivering violently, his thin coat offering no defense against the relentless chill. Matthew offered no kind words, no sermon on charity. He simply held up a steaming ladle, the promise of hot soup more potent than any rhetoric. The vagrant, his face a mask of gaunt desperation, looked from the ladle to the open door, seeing not a man, but salvation. For the starving, the promise of a single hot meal is a siren's call, powerful enough to extinguish all instinct for self-preservation. Without a word, the shivering man followed Matthew through the doorway, leaving the cold misery of the alley behind for the promised warmth within. The interior was dark, the only sound a faint, rhythmic dripping from somewhere deep inside the building. The air here was different, thick with a cloying, organic sweetness that clung to the back of the throat, an odor that was at once meaty and metallic. The vagrant, weak with hunger, barely registered it. He was focused only on the silhouette of Matthew, who led him further into the gloom. The heavy iron door swung shut behind them, its closing muffled by the stone walls. Then came a sound that echoed with chilling finality in the narrow corridor, the sharp, metallic clang of a heavy deadbolt sliding firmly into place. It was not the sound of a door being secured for the night. It was the sound of a cage being locked. a definitive seal separating the world of the living from the larder of the dead. Today, the lot where the Providence once stood remains conspicuously empty, a strange and barren scar in the dense urban fabric of the Lower East Side. Locals will tell you that the ground is tainted, that for over a century, nothing has ever grown there. Not a weed, not a blade of grass. They say the soil itself remembers the unspeakable acts committed in the basement below. The story has seeped into the city's folklore, a gruesome cautionary tale whispered to children about the true face of charity and the dangers that lurk behind a welcoming smile. Some who live nearby claim that on the coldest, quietest nights, when the city holds its breath, you can still hear faint, mournful sounds drifting from the vacant plot. They are not the wails of ghosts, they insist, but the eternal, echoing cries of the hungry, a hunger that was created and then consumed in the same terrible place. This legend is an echo that endures to this day, a testament to how the darkest chapters of history refuse to be forgotten. And since these stories travel through time and space, we ask you to tell us in the comments from which city you are joining us in this investigation, and the exact time of your arrival. With your presence now marked in our chronicle, let us return to 1890 and uncover how the first, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the impeccable facade of the brothers and their celebrated establishment. Sergeant Patrick O'Malley of the 13th Precinct was a man out of time, an anachronism of earnest duty in an era of institutionalized cynicism. While his colleagues saw the sprawling, impoverished warrens of the Lower East Side as a human sewer to be policed with grudging indifference, O'Malley saw a parish of lost souls. He knew their faces, their stories, the ghosts of past wars and distant famines that haunted their eyes. His daily beat was a series of small, quiet rituals, brief exchanges that affirmed the humanity his superiors preferred to ignore. He would share a piece of his lunch, offer a word of encouragement, or simply listen. These gestures were his private rebellion against the city's callousness, a small flicker of light in an overwhelming darkness. He believed, perhaps naively, that to see a man was to prevent him from disappearing entirely. It was a belief that was about to be tested in the most gruesome manner imaginable. Among the familiar figures on his route, none was more constant than Jedediah, a veteran of the Grand Army of the Republic who had left a piece of his leg and his entire future in the mud of Cold Harbor. Perched daily on an overturned crate in a small alcove, his worn blue uniform jacket was a threadbare flag of forgotten sacrifice. Jedediah was a man of quiet dignity, his conversations with O'Malley a litany of battlefield remembrances and wry observations about the changing city. The sergeant would often bring him a hot coffee, the steam a temporary shield against the biting river wind. They spoke of honor and duty, two men in different uniforms bound by a shared, unspoken code. For O'Malley, Jedediah wasn't just another vagrant. He was a living monument, a flesh-and-blood reminder of the debts a nation owed and had so readily forgotten. One crisp October morning, the alcove was empty. Jedediah's overturned crate sat alone, a stark and silent stage where a life had once been performed. O'Malley felt an immediate, prickling sense of unease. The veteran was as reliable as the sunrise, his absence a disruption in the natural order of the street. He inquired with a few of the other men huddled for warmth nearby, their faces impassive masks of practiced apathy. One of them shrugged, pulling a thin coat tighter around his shoulders. "Old Jedediah. Haven't seen him since yesterday," the man rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Good for him, I suppose. The brothers at the Providence probably took him in. They say once you get a bed in their shelter, you never have to face another cold night on the street again." The statement was meant as a testament to charity, but to O'Malley, it landed with the unsettling thud of a closing door. Miles away from the cold cobblestones of the alley, Elias moved through a world of velvet and gold. He was the very picture of Gilded Age benevolence, his name a fixture in the society pages, always mentioned in connection with some new charitable endowment or philanthropic committee. His speeches were masterclasses in calculated piety, weaving together scripture and civic duty into a comforting narrative for the city's elite. He assured them that their wealth was a divine trust, and that their patronage of his establishment was, in its own way, an act of grace, allowing him to extend a helping hand to the city's most wretched souls, men of industry and finance, their fortunes built on the backs of an exploited workforce, would listen with moist eyes, feeling their consciences soothed and their appetites whetted. Elias provided them with the invaluable service of absolution, served alongside the finest food in New York. The unsettling quiet of Jedediah's empty alcove was soon joined by another, more piercing silence. A young Irish mother named Aine, who was a daily fixture near the fish market, had also vanished. She was a wraith-like figure, her face etched with a desperation that was almost holy in its purity, always clutching a swaddled infant to her chest. Her plea for help was a soft melodic whisper, a stark contrast to the market's boisterous clamor. O'Malley had often slipped her a coin, his gaze always lingering on the quiet, still bundle in her arms. Now, she was gone. The space she occupied was just empty air, her memory already fading from the city's relentless churn. Two familiar faces, erased from the landscape in as many days. Coincidence was a luxury O'Malley's instincts could no longer afford. A pattern was emerging, its edges still blurry but its shape undeniably sinister. While Elias charmed the city's elite, his brother Matthew commanded a different domain. He was a creature of the restaurant's inner sanctum. The kitchens, the larders, the shadowed corridors that the clientele never saw. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, a hulking silhouette against the fire of the great ovens. His silence was profound, a dense, absorbing void that unnerved the kitchen staff. He communicated in grunts and gestures, his hands, large, calloused, and unnervingly deft, doing all the talking. They were the hands of a butcher, capable of breaking down a side of beef with a terrifying economy of motion. There was no art in his work, only a cold, methodical process of disassembly. The other cooks learned quickly to stay out of his way, to avert their eyes from the unsettling intensity with which he sharpened his cleavers and knives late into the night. Sergeant O'Malley felt the weight of his suspicions like a physical burden, pressing down on him during his long, solitary patrols. To voice such a thought aloud seemed a form of madness. Accuse Elias, the philanthropist, the darling of the press, the friend of judges and aldermen, of being connected to the disappearance of street dwellers. It was unthinkable. He could already hear the derisive laughter at the precinct, feel the captain's heavy hand on his shoulder as he was reassigned to the most tedious post imaginable. This was a city built on a rigid hierarchy, and men like Elias were at its pinnacle, protected by a fortress of wealth and influence. A lone patrolman with a conscience was less than a gnat to be swatted away. Yet, the image of Jedediah's empty crate and the memory of Aine's pleading eyes refused to grant him peace. The brothers' charity was a masterpiece of public relations, built on an unassailable foundation of secrecy. The shelter they supposedly ran was an enigma. It had no public address, no intake records, no paper trail of any kind. When asked, Elias would speak of protecting the dignity of the unfortunate, of offering a sanctuary free from the cold bureaucracy of city-run poorhouses. It was a noble sentiment, one that the public readily accepted. Who would question such benevolent discretion? But to O'Malley, this lack of transparency was no longer a virtue. It was a shroud. It was a locked room from which no sound escaped. It was the perfect mechanism for making people disappear, not through violence in a dark alley, but through an open door offered with a compassionate smile. The most effective traps are always baited with hope. Back in the opulent dining room of the Providence, the nightly ritual continued, oblivious to the questions forming in a lone policeman's mind. A wealthy banker, a regular patron, summoned Elias to his table to offer his compliments. "Elias, my good man, you have outdone yourself once again," he declared, gesturing with his spoon towards the nearly empty tureen. "This stew, it is the very soul of comfort. The meat is simply divine, unlike anything I have ever tasted. So tender, so rich. You must tell me your secret." Elias offered a practiced, humble smile, his eyes glinting in the gaslight. "There is no great secret, my friend," he replied, his voice a smooth balm. "Just a simple family recipe, passed down through generations. And, of course, a commitment to using only the freshest possible ingredients, sourced locally." The table erupted in appreciative laughter, savoring the irony of a fine joke they did not understand. Later that night, in the quiet, flickering gaslight of the 13th precinct, Sergeant O'Malley sat at his small desk, long after his shift had ended. The sounds of the city were muffled, distant. He opened a small, leather-bound notebook its pages clean and empty. Dipping his pen in the inkwell, he hesitated for a moment, then began to write. His penmanship was neat, precise, the script of a man imposing order on a chaotic world. On the first page, he wrote a heading, "The Disappeared." Beneath it, he inscribed the first entry, October 12, 1890, Jedediah Mills, veteran, 71st New York Infantry, last seen near the corner of Hester and Orchard. A few lines down, he added the second, October 15, 1890, Ain O'Connell and infant son, last seen near Fulton Fish Market. He was no longer just a patrolman. He was a chronicler, the sole historian of the forgotten, and his investigation had just begun. The rhythm of the city's underbelly is one of desperate survival, a frantic dance performed daily by its most invisible citizens. Among them was a boy known only as Finn, a wiry street urchin whose small frame and quick fingers made him an adept scavenger. He had considered Jedediah Mills a friend, one of the few constants in a life of perpetual motion. The old soldier would share stories, not just of cannons and smoke, but of a time when honor meant something more than a tarnished medal pinned to a threadbare coat. Finn had admired that medal, a small silver disc from the Grand Army of the Republic, which Jedediah would polish with a calloused thumb while recounting tales of valor. Its absence, like the man himself, left a void in the boy's world, a silence that felt heavier and more final than the usual indifference of the streets. It was this nagging emptiness that drew him, day after day, to the alley behind the Providence. It was in the shadow of the great restaurant, amidst the refuse of its gluttony, that Finn conducted his daily search. The air was a foul miasma of discarded food, grease, and the chemical tang of lye used to clean the cobblestones. He moved with practiced efficiency, his small hands sifting through piles of vegetable peelings, broken crates, and other detritus cast out from the kitchen's back door. He was looking for anything of value, a half-eaten loaf of bread, a discarded bottle, a piece of scrap metal. But on this day, his search was less about sustenance and more about a desperate, unspoken question. He was looking for a sign, a clue, anything that might explain the sudden and complete erasure of the old soldier who had shown him a rare and precious kindness. His fingers probed the cold, slick mud near a row of overflowing trash bins, a place where the city's waste mingled in a grim soup. Then his fingers brushed against something hard and cool, something that was not a stone or a piece of broken porcelain. He dug into the grime, his heart beginning to beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. He pulled the object free from the mud's grip and wiped it on his sleeve. It was a small circular piece of metal, its surface tarnished to a dull leaden gray, but its form was unmistakable. An eagle was etched onto its face, wings outstretched, clutching a bundle of arrows. It was Jedediah's medal. The small silver clasp, which had always been faulty, was bent open, as if it had been torn from his neck in a struggle. The boy stared at it, the cold metal seeming to burn his palm, a silent testament from a man who could no longer speak. A man he was told had found sanctuary was, in fact, just another piece of refuse. A cold dread, far more chilling than the autumn wind, washed over Finn. He understood, with the brutal clarity of a child who has only ever known the world's sharpest edges, what this discovery meant. Jedediah would never have parted with this medal. It was his last connection to a life of purpose, the only proof that he had once been a man of value. To find it here, discarded like an oyster shell in the restaurant's garbage, was not a sign of misfortune. It was an accusation. It was physical proof that the old soldier's final moments had not been spent in a warm bed, but here, in the filth and shadows of this alley. The benevolent stories about the brothers and their shelter curdled in his mind, transforming into a monstrous lie. The boy's breath caught in his throat, and he scrambled away from the bins, clutching the metal so tightly its edges dug into his skin. Panic gave way to a singular, driving thought. There was only one person in this entire sprawling city who had ever looked at Jedediah and seen a man rather than a nuisance. There was only one person who had listened to his stories and acknowledged his existence: Sergeant Patrick O'Malley. The boy knew he couldn't go to the precinct, a place of loud voices and dismissive glares. He had to find the sergeant on his beat, where the man was not just a uniform but a familiar presence, a fixed point of order in a chaotic world. Finn ran, his bare feet slapping against the cold cobblestones. the small silver medal a heavy secret in his fist. He dodged carts and pedestrians, his eyes scanning every corner, every street, searching for the tall, steady figure of the one man he believed might actually care that another forgotten soul had been consumed by the city's insatiable hunger. He found O'Malley near the edge of his patrol, his expression grim as he watched the endless flow of humanity. Finn didn't hesitate. He ran up to the officer, his chest heaving, and thrust his grimy hand forward, uncurling his fingers to reveal the tarnished prize. "Sergeant," he gasped, his voice thin and reedy. "It's Jedediah's. His medal." He pointed a trembling finger back in the direction from which he had come. "I found it. In the mud. Behind their place. Behind the Providence." The words tumbled out, a frantic, desperate confession. He didn't need to explain the significance. He could see in the sudden, sharp focus of O'Malley's eyes that the officer understood completely. The boy had not just delivered an object. He had delivered a verdict, a tangible piece of a horror that, until this moment, had only been a formless suspicion in the policeman's mind. Sergeant O'Malley took the medal from the boy's hand. Its weight was negligible, but it felt as heavy as a tombstone. He had seen it 100 times, catching the light as Jedediah gestured with his hands while telling a story. The bent clasp confirmed Finn's unspoken theory. This was not lost. It was torn away. The vague, unsettling feeling that had been gnawing at him for days now coalesced into a cold, hard knot of certainty in the pit of his stomach. The disappearances of Jedediah and Ain were no longer abstract events, no longer unfortunate coincidences to be filed away and forgotten. They were now anchored to a specific time and a specific place by this small, damning piece of silver. It was the first piece of physical evidence, a direct and undeniable link between a missing man and the celebrated establishment that had supposedly offered him salvation. The location of the discovery was the most damning detail of all. The medal wasn't found across town or in the inventory of some back-alley pawnbroker. It was found in the restaurant's own refuse, mingled with the waste of the very meals that had made the brothers famous. The irony was so grotesque, so profoundly perverse, that it almost defied belief. The last physical remnant of a man they claimed to have sheltered was discarded with the remnants of their feasts. O'Malley turned the medal over in his fingers, the cold metal a conduit for the cold truth. The facade of Christian charity that Elias had so carefully constructed was beginning to crack, and through that crack, O'Malley could now glimpse the outline of an almost unimaginable evil. The celebrated stew, the brothers' generosity, the hidden shelter, it was all part of the same monstrous machine. He knew, with a sinking feeling, what this meant. This single piece of evidence was both everything and nothing. To him, it was a confession cast in silver, but to his superiors, it was merely the word of a street urchin against that of Elias, one of the city's most beloved philanthropists. To bring this accusation forward would be professional suicide. Elias would crush him with his influence, bury him under a mountain of public goodwill and political connections. The captain would laugh him out of the precinct, and he would be lucky to keep his job, let alone pursue the truth. O'Malley was alone, a solitary sentinel standing against a fortress of lies. But looking down at the medal, he knew he had no choice. This was no longer about a hunch. It was about a duty, not to the department, but to the memory of the man who wore it. Looking down at Finn's frightened but resolute face, O'Malley gently closed his hand around the medal, its metallic edges pressing into his palm. He had made a promise to himself to see the people of his beat, to ensure they did not simply vanish without a trace. That promise was now being called due. The small, tarnished disc in his hand was no longer just a piece of military history. It was a key, the first one he had found that might unlock the dark secrets hidden within the walls of the Providence. It was a fragile beginning, a single thread to pull in the hopes of unraveling a tapestry of unimaginable horror. His unofficial chronicle of the disappeared had just gained its first piece of physical proof, and Sergeant Patrick O'Malley's true investigation was about to begin, plunging him into a darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. Sergeant O'Malley's investigation began not on the streets, but in the stale, silent air of the city's Hall of Records. Surrounded by towering shelves of ledgers bound in decaying leather, he sought the official footprint of the brothers' famed charity. For 2 full days, he meticulously combed through permits, property deeds, and charitable institution licenses filed since 1880. He found nothing. There was no record of a shelter operated by Elias or Matthew. No health inspections, no occupancy permits, no registered address. According to the city of New York, the sanctuary that supposedly saved so many souls from the cold was a complete fiction. It existed only in the society pages of newspapers and the self-serving speeches of its founder. This official void was the first piece of evidence, a silence that spoke with the volume of a scream, suggesting a place that operated entirely outside the law and the light. Returning to the 13th precinct, O'Malley delved into a different kind of archive, the forgotten histories of his own department. He spent a long night reviewing the logbooks for missing persons reports filed from the Lower East Side over the past 5 years. The entries were sparse, a testament not to the safety of the district, but to the profound invisibility of its inhabitants. A person must first be seen to be missed. Who was there to file a report for a man like Jedediah, a man whose only connections were to a past war and the fleeting camaraderie of the street? The records showed a handful of inquiries from distant relatives of newly arrived immigrants, but these trails always went cold. The cases closed with apathetic finality. The system was designed to ignore these people in life. It was cruelly efficient at forgetting them in death, providing the perfect hunting ground for any predator who understood this fundamental truth. The next phase of his inquiry took him back to the public library, where he hunched over a microfilm reader, the flickering glow illuminating his determined face. He scrolled through years of the New York Times and the Herald, tracing the public ascent of Elias and the Providence. He found dozens of articles, each one a polished stone in the monument of Elias's reputation. They were filled with effusive praise for his culinary genius and, more importantly, his Christian benevolence. Journalists recounted his eloquent speeches on civic duty and quoted society mavens who lauded his selfless work. Yet, when it came to the shelter itself, the details remained maddeningly vague. It was always a discreet haven, or a private sanctuary, its location kept secret to protect the dignity of its residents. The press had swallowed the narrative whole, never once asking the most basic question: where, precisely, did the forgotten go? Frustrated by the paper trail of propaganda, O'Malley shifted his focus to human intelligence. Knowing the truth often resided in whispers, not headlines. He began to discreetly question current and former employees of the Providence, a task that proved nearly impossible. The current staff were a wall of terrified silence, their loyalty bought with steady wages and cemented by a palpable fear of the hulking, quiet brother who ruled the kitchen. They would offer nervous praise for Elias's generosity and then quickly find a reason to end the conversation, their eyes avoiding his. He could feel Matthew's shadow looming over every interaction, a silent enforcer whose reputation for cold severity was enough to guarantee compliance. This pervasive fear was not the normal deference of employees. It was the disciplined silence of co-conspirators or, worse, of hostages. His persistence finally yielded a crack in the wall. He located a young man named Thomas Byrne, a former dishwasher at the restaurant, now working at the chaotic Fulton Fish Market. O'Malley found him hauling crates of ice, his face gaunt and his hands chapped raw. At the mention of the Providence, a flicker of genuine terror crossed the young man's face. It took O'Malley half an hour of patient, gentle persuasion, assuring him of protection, before Thomas finally agreed to speak. Leading the sergeant to a quiet corner behind a stack of empty barrels, the stench of fish hanging heavy in the air. His voice was a low, trembling whisper, as if he feared Matthew himself might emerge from the shadows to silence him permanently. He was not just recounting a job, he was confessing a trauma. In his meticulously kept notebook, O'Malley recorded Thomas Byrne's statement, dated November 3, 1890. Thomas described the kitchen as a kingdom with Matthew as its silent, absolute monarch. His word was law, communicated through grunts and menacing glares. But above all other rules, one was sacrosanct. No one, under any circumstances, was ever permitted to enter the basement. The door, a heavy oak slab reinforced with iron straps, was always secured with a massive deadbolt, for which only Matthew had the key. It was not treated as a simple storeroom. It was guarded with the grim finality of a prison gate. To even glance at it for too long was to earn a cold, lingering stare from the younger brother that promised swift and severe consequences. Thomas recounted a specific incident that had precipitated his departure. A new potboy, clumsy and nervous, had dropped a stack of plates near the basement entrance. One plate slid under the door. Matthew, who had been butchering a side of beef, did not shout. He simply stopped, wiped his hands on his blood-stained apron, and walked over to the boy. He lifted the teenager a foot off the ground by his collar, his expression utterly devoid of emotion, and whispered something in his ear. The boy turned deathly pale and began to tremble uncontrollably. He was fired on the spot and fled the restaurant without collecting his pay. Thomas never saw him again. The incident was a chilling demonstration of the absolute, violent boundary that protected whatever secrets lay below the kitchen floor. The most disturbing part of Thomas's testimony was a detail O'Malley had been dreading. The former dishwasher described a smell. On quiet nights, after the dinner service had ended and the fires in the great ovens were banked low, a peculiar odor would sometimes seep from under the basement door. He struggled to find the words for it, describing it as a cloying, sickly sweet scent, thick and organic, with an underlying metallic tang like old pennies. It was nothing like the savory aromas from the kitchen. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, but with a strange, sweetish note of decay that clung to the air and made the hairs on his arms stand up. The smell, he said, was the reason he quit. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was the smell of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. With Thomas Burns' testimony recorded, O'Malley felt the tumblers of the lock clicking into place. He now had a witness who could place the secrecy, the intimidation, and a deeply disturbing sensory detail within the restaurant's walls. The narrative was no longer just a collection of disappearances and a single, tarnished metal. It now had an internal geography of terror, a forbidden zone guarded by a silent monster. As he walked away from the fish market, the imagined sweet, metallic odor seemed to follow him, a phantom scent that confirmed his darkest suspicions. He was no longer just investigating a series of missing persons. He was hunting a creature that had turned a place of fine dining into a charnel house. But as O'Malley's quiet investigation drew closer to the truth began to push back. The city's network of power, built on favors and influence, was activated. One afternoon, Sergeant O'Malley was summoned to the office of his precinct captain, a man named Davies, whose primary skill was avoiding controversy. Captain Davies, usually florid and boisterous, was uncharacteristically pale and tense. He didn't offer O'Malley a seat. He informed him that he had just received a visit from a city alderman, a man whose name carried immense weight in Tammany Hall, and who happened to be a regular diner at the Providence and a close, personal friend of Elias. The message was not subtle. It was a clear and direct warning shot across the bow of O'Malley's career. The captain relayed the alderman's message, a masterpiece of veiled threats wrapped in feigned concern. Elias, the philanthropist, was deeply troubled to hear that one of the city's officers was harassing his staff and casting aspersions on his life's work. The alderman had suggested, quite pointedly, that an officer with such a vivid imagination might find his talents better utilized in a less demanding post, perhaps overseeing the quiet docks of Staten Island. O'Malley tried to protest, to lay out the evidence he had gathered, the metal, the non-existent shelter, the witness testimony. Davies cut him off with a sharp, impatient gesture. A street urchin's trinket and the ramblings of a fired dishwasher. Against Elias, the man is a saint, Patrick. He dines with the mayor. You are ordered to cease this private vendetta immediately. Leaving the captain's office, O'Malley felt the full weight of the system aligned against him. He was no longer just fighting two men. He was fighting the entire edifice of a society that had prejudged Elias as a good man based on his wealth and public performance of piety. Elias had built a fortress of influence around himself, and its walls were thicker than any prisons. Walking his beat that night, the familiar streets felt alien and hostile. He saw the city's hypocrisy in every gaslit window of the mansions uptown, in every shivering figure huddled in the alleys downtown. The system wasn't broken. It was designed this way. It was designed to protect men like Elias and to make men like Jedediah disappear without a ripple. That night, in his small, Spartan apartment, O'Malley laid out the contents of his secret investigation on his small wooden table. Jedediah's tarnished metal, the notes from the Hall of Records, confirming the shelter was a phantom, the detailed, terrified testimony of Thomas Byrne. It was a compelling collection of circumstantial evidence, enough to convince him, but he knew it was not enough to convince a judge to issue a warrant against a man as powerful and well-protected as Elias. The captain's order meant any further official inquiry was impossible. He was alone, officially warned off the case, and his targets now knew they were being watched. Time was running out, not only for him, but for whomever was currently locked in that basement. Driven by a new sense of urgency, he shifted his focus from the what to the who. He needed to understand the brothers themselves, particularly the enigmatic Matthew. He spent another day in the city archives, this time poring over old census records and birth certificates, tracing the family's origins. Elias's history was as expected, clean and unremarkable, the carefully curated past of a man preparing for public life. But after hours of searching, he found a faint trace of Matthew. An old census ledger from a rural county north of the city listed the family, and beside the name of the father, the occupation was listed in faint, spidery script, hog farmer and butcher. The two words seemed to leap off the page, cold and sharp. The discovery sent a profound chill through O'Malley, a moment of dreadful clarity. Matthew wasn't just a cook who had learned his trade in a kitchen. He was raised in the craft of slaughter. He would have learned, from a young age, the methodical process of raising livestock, of fattening them for the kill, and of butchering a carcass with maximum efficiency to yield the best cuts of meat. He would understand the anatomy, the tools, the entire cold calculus of transforming a living creature into a product. The unspeakable possibility that had been a formless horror in O'Malley's mind now had a practical, terrifying precedent. The skills required to run a hog farm were hideously transferable. He now saw the entire operation in its full, grotesque detail. It was a perfect, self-contained ecosystem of evil. Elias, the charming public face, used the bait of Christian charity to lure in the city's most vulnerable, a population no one would miss. He was the farmer, selecting the stock. Matthew, the silent butcher, then took over, applying the cold, pragmatic skills of his upbringing in the hidden abattoir beneath the restaurant. The final, monstrous irony was that the product of this human slaughter was then served upstairs, celebrated as the pinnacle of fine dining by the very society whose indifference created the victims in the first place. It was a cycle of industrial cannibalism, hidden in plain sight, protected by wealth and piety. With this final, horrifying piece of insight, O'Malley knew his investigation had reached its end. He had followed the threads of evidence as far as they would go through conventional means. The official channels were closed to him, blocked by the very corruption he was trying to expose. To continue his quiet inquiries would be futile and would only give the brothers more time to cover their tracks or, worse, to dispose of any living evidence they held in their cellar. There was no more time for subtlety. He could not request a warrant. He would have to force the city's hand. Sitting in the dark of his apartment, the silver medal cool against his palm, Sergeant Patrick O'Malley began to plan the raid. He would not just open the door to the basement, he would kick it off its hinges in the middle of dinner service. The evening of November 15, 1890, was the zenith of the Providence's social calendar. The dining room was a symphony of Gilded Age excess, the air shimmering with the heat from the gas lamps and the glow of diamonds on the necks of the city's most powerful women. Elias, a perfect conductor of this orchestra, moved between tables with effortless grace, his voice a low, reassuring murmur. It was at this precise moment of peak opulence that the grand entrance doors were thrown open with a violent crash. Sergeant Patrick O'Malley stood on the threshold, flanked by 6 uniformed officers, their grim expressions and drawn batons, a brutalist intrusion into the delicate tableau. The clinking of silverware ceased, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of collective breath. For a moment, the entire room was frozen in a state of stunned disbelief, the patrons unable to reconcile the scene before them with the world they inhabited. Elias was the first to recover, his face a mask of practiced indignation. He glided towards O'Malley, his hands spread in a gesture of magnanimous disbelief. "Sergeant," he began, his voice laced with a tone of weary disappointment, "what is the meaning of this outrageous spectacle? You are terrifying my guests. If you have some grievance, surely it can be addressed in a civilized manner, not with this thuggery." He glanced meaningfully at the table where the city alderman sat, a clear and final attempt to wield the power that had protected him for so long. But O'Malley's eyes were as cold and hard as iron. He held up a warrant, the official seal of the city, a stark refutation of Elias's influence. Elias, O'Malley's voice cut through the room, devoid of deference. By the authority of the city of New York, this establishment is being searched. Ignoring the gasps and frantic whispers that erupted from the diners, O'Malley and his men pushed past the stunned restaurateur. Their heavy boots marked a muddy, determined path across the pristine, polished floors, a direct course set for the kitchen. The patrons, moments before the pinnacle of society, were now merely spectators to a drama far more real and visceral than any they had witnessed on a stage. They watched as the officers disappeared through the swinging doors, leaving Elias standing alone in the center of the room, his charming facade beginning to fracture under the weight of this public and undeniable challenge. The spell was broken. The carefully constructed world of the Providence was collapsing inward, the foundation of its benevolence revealed to be nothing more than a carefully decorated trapdoor leading straight to hell. In the steam and clatter of the kitchen, they found Matthew. He was standing before a massive butcher's block, a long, freshly sharpened cleaver held loosely in his hand. He did not seem surprised by the intrusion. He simply stopped his work and turned his head slowly, his eyes flat and devoid of any discernible emotion. He looked at O'Malley, then at the officers fanning out behind him. With the same detached appraisal he might give a side of beef. There was no fear, no anger, not even curiosity. There was only a profound and unsettling stillness, the calm of a man whose work was interrupted but not invalidated. His silence was more menacing than any threat, a quiet declaration that the world of rules and warrants held no power in his domain. The kitchen staff, paralyzed with terror, flattened themselves against the walls, trying to become invisible. O'Malley's gaze went directly to the heavy, iron-strapped door at the back of the kitchen. "Open it," he commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. Matthew did not move. He simply stood there, a hulking, blood-aproned statue, the cleaver still in his hand. Two officers moved forward, their nightsticks raised. Without a word, Matthew set the cleaver down on the block with a soft, deliberate thud. He then turned his back on them and walked to the sinks, where he began to meticulously wash his hands, his movements slow and methodical, as if the entire raid were a minor inconvenience he had already dismissed. He would not participate, but he would not resist. O'Malley gestured to his men. "Take it down." The officers brought forth a heavy iron ram, and the first blow against the oak door boomed through the building like a cannon shot. With the third strike, the wood around the deadbolt splintered and tore, and the door burst inward with a scream of tortured metal. The first thing that hit them was the smell. It was the scent Thomas Byrne had described, but 1,000 times more potent, a physical wave of putrescence that made the hardened officers gag and recoil. It was a thick, cloying sweetness of rot, layered over the coppery tang of old blood and the sharp, chemical bite of lie. It was an ancient, primal odor, the smell of a predator's den, of death and digestion. It clung to their clothes, their hair, the back of their throats, an immediate and vile contamination. O'Malley, steeling himself, was the first to step across the threshold, his lantern held high, plunging into the darkness that had held its secrets for so long. The lantern light cut through the gloom, revealing a scene from a medieval nightmare. The basement was a long, narrow space with a damp, earthen floor. Along one wall were a series of large iron cages, like those used for livestock at a market, but they were not empty. In two of the cages, huddled in the far corners, were human beings. They were emaciated, their bodies little more than skeletons draped in filthy rags, their eyes wide with a terror that had long ago burned past sanity. They did not cry out or speak. They simply stared at the light, blinking like creatures who had not seen the sun in an eternity. A young officer behind O'Malley stumbled back, his hand over his mouth, a choked sob escaping his lips. This was not a shelter. It was a human larder. O'Malley moved the lantern, its beam sweeping across the rest of the room. The sight was a study in grotesque contradiction. Opposite the cages, the area was immaculately clean. The floor was paved with stone slabs, angled towards a central drain. A large, stained wooden table stood in the center, flanked by racks holding an array of hooks, saws, and knives of every size, all sharpened to a gleam. A series of heavy iron tubs were stacked neatly against the far wall. There was not a speck of dried blood or viscera to be seen. It was a butcher's workshop, organized with the cold, obsessive precision of a surgeon. The sheer professionalism of the setup, its methodical cleanliness, was somehow more horrifying than the cages. This was not the work of a madman. It was the work of an artisan. It was on a small, sturdy lectern near the butchering table that O'Malley found the final, damning piece of evidence. It was a large, leather-bound ledger, identical to the ones used for accounting in any legitimate business. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat, precise script, the handwriting of a meticulous clerk. But the contents were a catalog of industrial slaughter. The columns were headed with chillingly mundane titles: date of acquisition, specimen name, description, initial weight, feeding regimen, and the final, stark column, processing date. Each entry was a human life reduced to a set of production metrics. Elias had not been running a charity. He had been running a farm, and Matthew was his master butcher, perfecting a horrifying new form of husbandry. O'Malley ran his finger down the page, his breath catching in his throat as he found the entry he knew he would. October 12, 1890, specimen name, Jedediah Mills, GAR veteran, initial weight, 142 lbs, feeding regimen, broth, stew, 2x daily. Processing date, October 14, 1890. Beneath it, in a small parenthetical note, was a final, pragmatic observation. Note: meat tough, stringy, best for long-cooked stew base. In that single, cold sentence, the entire monstrous truth was laid bare. The celebrated stew, the dish that had built an empire of taste and philanthropy, was not just a recipe. It was a graveyard. Every compliment from a wealthy patron had been a eulogy for a forgotten man. Every savory spoonful a final act of unknowing desecration. Jedediah had not simply been murdered, he had been consumed. He carried the ledger back up the stairs, the book feeling as heavy as a coffin in his hands. He emerged into the kitchen, where Matthew was still calmly drying his hands, his back to the scene. Elias was there now, held between two officers, his face a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. The charming philanthropist was gone, replaced by a hollow shell, his eyes darting frantically towards the open basement door as if he could will its horrors back into the darkness. O'Malley held up the ledger, its open page facing Elias. "Your accounting seems to be in perfect order," he said, his voice flat and dead. A sound escaped Elias's throat, a high-pitched, inhuman keen of pure terror, the sound of a man seeing his own soul reflected in the pages of a book. As officers placed Elias in irons, his body went limp, his mind finally snapping under the weight of the absolute exposure. He began to babble, a torrent of scripture and panicked denials that devolved into incoherent sobs. But Matthew remained a pillar of unnerving calm. As an officer approached him with handcuffs, the large man simply turned, offering his wrists without a word. There was no struggle, no denial. His expression was one of quiet, almost serene finality. He glanced at the open ledger in O'Malley's hand, and for the first time a flicker of something registered in his eyes. It was not remorse. It was not fear. It was a faint, almost imperceptible nod of professional pride. The craftsman acknowledging his life's work. The officers led the brothers out through the main dining room, a path of shame that forced them to pass the stunned faces of their former patrons. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of a woman vomiting into a linen napkin. The air, once filled with the rich, intoxicating aroma of the famous stew, now seemed to carry the foul, sweet stench from the basement below. The scent had not changed, only the knowledge of its ingredients had. In that moment, every diner in the room was united in a single, sickening realization. They were not just witnesses to a crime, they were the final, unwitting accomplices in a cycle of cannibalism that had fed their vanity with the flesh of the invisible. The news spread through the city like a fever. As the brothers were loaded into a police wagon, a crowd began to gather, their faces a mixture of disbelief and a rising, guttural rage. The initial whispers turned into shouts as the details of the basement's contents were leaked. The story was so monstrous so profoundly perverse that it defied all reason. The city's greatest philanthropist and its most celebrated chef were not men of God. They were monsters who had turned the Christian virtue of charity into a production line for human slaughter. The foundation of New York's Gilded Age society, built on the illusion of a moral and benevolent elite, had just been shattered by the contents of a single, meticulously kept ledger. The trial would be a formality. The city had already passed its judgment. The trial of Elias and Matthew was not a legal proceeding. It was a public dissection of the city's soul. The courtroom was packed daily with the very same socialites who had once filled the tables of the Providence, their faces now a grotesque mixture of morbid curiosity and dawning self-revulsion. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was not a witness, but an object, Matthew's ledger. As the prosecutor read aloud from its pages, detailing the cold calculus of fattening and processing, a wave of nausea rippled through the gallery. Elias, his facade utterly shattered, wept and babbled incoherently, a man drowned in the horror of his own exposed sin. Matthew, by contrast, sat in stoic silence, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his demeanor not of a man on trial for his life, but of a master craftsman whose trade secrets were being clumsily revealed to an audience of amateurs who could never truly appreciate the work. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, delivered in a courtroom so silent one could hear the frantic scratching of reporters' pens. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. New York, in its collective shame and fury, demanded a spectacle, a cleansing ritual to purge the monstrous stain the brothers had left upon its reputation. The public execution was the most attended in the city's history, a grim festival of vengeance. On the gallows, Elias was a trembling, pathetic wreck, his final words a choked prayer for a mercy he had never shown. Matthew, however, faced his end with the same unnerving calm with which he had lived his life. He offered no final words, no plea, no confession. He simply met the executioner's gaze with a look of blank, pragmatic acceptance, as if this, too, were merely the final, logical step in a process he had long ago set in motion. But for the enraged citizens of New York, the death of the brothers was not enough. The evil they had wrought was so profound that it seemed to have physically contaminated the very bricks and mortar of their establishment. A week after the execution, a mob, fueled by whiskey and a righteous, primal fury, descended upon the shuttered restaurant. They moved not with the chaos of a riot, but with the grim purpose of exorcists. They shattered the windows, splintered the mahogany tables, and tore the velvet curtains from their rods. Then, with torches held high, they set the building ablaze. The fire was a towering inferno, a pillar of judgment against the night sky, its flames consuming the last vestiges of a place where opulence and abomination had become one. The city watched it burn, hoping the ashes would bury the memory forever. Their hopes were in vain. When the embers cooled and the smoke cleared, the lot where the Providence once stood was a blackened, barren scar, and it remained so. Decades passed. The city grew and changed around it, but the small plot of land on the Lower East Side resisted all attempts at renewal. Locals claimed the ground was cursed, poisoned by the sheer volume of blood and lie that had seeped into the earth from the basement abattoir. No grass would grow, no weed would take root. The soil itself seemed to hold a sterile memory of the unspeakable, a permanent and physical testament to the horrors it had absorbed. The empty lot became a geographical anomaly, a void in the urban landscape that served as a constant, silent reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the city's gilded surface. The psychological fallout for the restaurant's former patrons was a more subtle, but no less profound, form of haunting. The men and women who had once lauded the famous stew now found themselves physically unable to stomach fine food. The memory of its exquisite taste was now inextricably linked to the knowledge of its hideous origin, a phantom flavor of human misery that turned every meal into an act of potential desecration. The rich, savory aroma of roasting meat, once a symbol of comfort and status, now triggered waves of violent nausea. They were tormented by their own unwitting complicity, their gluttony a source of deep, unshakable shame. In the privacy of their opulent homes, they became the final, haunted victims of the brothers, forever chained to the memory of the meal they could never forget and could never digest. Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, the man who had dragged the horror into the light, was not hailed as a hero. In the eyes of the city's elite, he was a grim reminder of their own willful blindness, the man who had forced them to look into the abyss that they had paid handsomely to ignore. His dogged pursuit of the truth had exposed a rot that implicated not just two men, but the entire social structure that had allowed them to flourish. He was thanked quietly, commended for his duty in a private ceremony, and then, shortly thereafter, transferred to a remote, uneventful post in Staten Island. His career, once promising, was effectively over. He had won his battle against the monsters, but in doing so, he had lost his war against a system that valued comfortable lies over inconvenient truths, a system that would always punish the messenger who delivered bad news. Over time, the gruesome facts of the case began to soften and warp, slowly transforming from a documented criminal history into a macabre urban legend. The specific names and dates faded from public memory, but the elemental horror of the story endured. The brothers became archetypal figures of evil, their tale a cautionary fable whispered to children to warn them of the dangers of accepting kindness from strangers. "Don't talk to men who offer you soup," mothers would say, "or you'll end up in the stew." The story detached itself from its historical anchor, becoming a timeless piece of New York folklore, a narrative ghost that haunted the city's collective imagination, a grim reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who wear the most benevolent masks. To this day, the vacant lot remains a place of quiet dread in a city that never sleeps. The story of the Providence has become a fixture on ghost tours, a lurid tale told to visitors for a cheap thrill. But for those who live nearby, it is something more. They speak of the unnatural cold that seems to emanate from the barren soil, even on the warmest summer nights. They talk of faint, mournful sounds that drift from the empty space when the wind is still, not screams of terror, but the low, desperate cries of an insatiable hunger that was never satisfied. The lot is not just a memorial to the dead, it is seen as a lingering wound, a place where the veil between the city of the living and the larder of the consumed is unnervingly thin. The saga of the brothers forces us to confront a question that is as unsettling as the crime itself. Who, in the end, was the true monster? Was it Matthew, the silent butcher who reduced human beings to mere product with cold, industrial efficiency? Was it Elias, the charming sociopath who weaponized the virtue of charity to bait his traps? Or was the greater monstrosity the society that surrounded them? A society so obsessed with its own gilded reflection that it rendered an entire class of people invisible, creating a population so thoroughly forgotten that they could be harvested like cattle from the streets, with no one to mark their passing or to ask where they had gone. The Providence was a slaughterhouse, but it was built on a foundation of profound and systemic indifference. The ledger of Matthew the Butcher is a testament to how easily humanity can be erased by a few strokes of a pen. These stories, etched in the darkest corners of our history, serve as a vital, if terrifying, record. They remind us that the veneer of civilization is fragile and that a society is ultimately judged by how it treats its most vulnerable. Ensuring that these chapters are never torn from our collective memory is the solemn duty of the chronicler. To guarantee that the most disturbing chapters of our past are never forgotten, subscribe and help us preserve this archive of shadows.